Haidong. In this video, we're going to talk about aspects of Yedo 1. So under our new way of doing things, Yedo is associated with people currently second degrees going for third degree. So Yedo, so again, a brief thing. I know I made a video about this in the past, but Yedo is in general considered to be using a short sword. Again, that is really vague. Again, I have my own interpretations of what that might mean. But in general, the idea is you're using at least a shorter sword than what you usually would do. Now, if you do want to know my personal opinion on it, the idea is, again, if Ssangsu is using a Ssangsu gum, which is a huge, really long sword, so Yedo just means shorter sword. Anything shorter than, again, as tall as you are kind of counts. So technically, what we usually train with could be considered a Yedo. Using, I'm pointing over here because that's where it is, using like a Chinese Dao or maybe a Zhang, right, so a straight sword. I haven't tried with a straight sword actually, although the broadsword actually works. I'm gonna actually bring it over. I've actually gone through the Yedo using this particular sword. Now you might notice I don't use the flags because, I mean, frankly, they annoy me just because I'm not used to, again, having flags on my sword. But using a Dao or a Chinese broadsword works very, very well, especially with Yedo. To a certain degree, also works pretty well with Bangkok as well. But at least the techniques that we go with, now there will be counterexamples, right? So there will be techniques that we can't really reinforce, we can't really use with this kind of sword. That said, there are also similar techniques, again, that you wouldn't really be able to use with the Ssangsu gum in Ssangsu, right? But this is like a little pet idea that I have, is that you can actually use a one-handed sword in Yedo. So to a certain degree, I don't know why I had trouble with that, to a certain degree, I believe, again, without any confirmation from really any other master, but I believe Yedo can be pretty happy as a one-handed style. Now there will be counterexamples to it, again, within it, but in general, so by and large, can be a one-handed style. A quick note on this particular video, all three of these are interpretations of specific techniques that I have made myself, right? So they aren't really anything that I've heard from anyone either higher up from the Federation or anyone from my peers or anything like that. These are all entirely my own ideas. I've, again, played with my students, again, trying to find applications, again, why we do certain things, right? So this particular video has a lot more of, again, new ideas, but new ideas, again, with regard to an interpretation. So just keep that in mind. So this video is actually maybe entirely not canonical, so I guess view with your own warning, with a grain of salt, whatever that might be. Let's take a look, right? So our first one, and it's actually one of the first techniques actually in the form, right, is this horizontal thrust, right? So again, in the form, we do a little bit of our draw, and we start here, right? Now, we might think like, oh, that's obvious, that's a stab, right? Because we've done something very similar, right? So if we do, again, Ssangsu 5, again, same exact thing, just we're now in short stance, same exact thing, and that idea was to puncture between the ribs. Okay. Why do I have a problem with that? Why do I have a problem with nice things? What happens next, right? And also think about all the other times we do the stab. If I do, in fact, thrust, and I am embedded in your rib, the next move in the form is going straight up, sliding block, sliding block. It's gonna be hard to do. It's gonna be hard to do that if I'm embedded into your your core, just that way, right? Likewise with the later part of the form, if I just thrust it into someone's chest and I spin out, maybe, right? So maybe I might be able to kind of like nick it out of the the ribs, but again, not particularly likely. So that raises a red flag, right? Again, these forms were developed to do a certain thing. What might that be doing? So my interpretation, again, really canonical, is it's a defense. And I've actually used this in sparring quite a lot to kind of just see if it really works. It actually works kind of happily, right? The idea is here, right? So if I'm kind of fighting you, dear watcher, we're here and I'm pressuring here, right? So this is me being able to pressure you more horizontally, but I can also, again, given the curvature of the sword, I can push forward and still trying to, again, push their sword off to the side. Now, what do you want to do, right? So if I'm pressuring you here, and I'm more or less, again, this is not really what's going on, but more or less your sword's being pushed this way, what do you want to do? Like, I don't like being pushed, I'm going to push back. What's the next move? You're here, I'm going to use a sliding block to that right side, right? So if I'm using this as a defense, again, I'm using that to pressure you, trying to deflect your sword a little bit, you kind of fall for it. I can sliding block, and now you're on a very heavy defensive. A sliding block done well is really, really disorienting unless if you're used to turning around that way. So if you're slid down this way, it's like, oh no, your sword's right there. Obviously you might try to do like something like that. You might learn to go with the momentum, but then your sword might still be there. It's a lot to deal with, right? But again, for you as the attacker, this works really well. If I'm here and I'm pressuring, again, with this thrust, right? Once I release the pressure, their sword goes this way, and I can keep moving on with the rest of the form pretty happily. And this actually goes pretty well with all the other aspects or all the other instances of this in Yedo 1. So using a defense to, again, pressure, again, to push the opponent's sword offline isn't a new idea. From this position, it is, right? And it's also a reinterpretation of, again, thrust. Now we're going to do that a little bit later as well, but using, again, different positions that might be considered something else as a defense is going to be a fairly new-ish idea here. Another thing I would like for you to consider is how do you deflect usually with this form? Or not necessarily this form, but this style as well. So definitely this form, also this style. You usually don't do power versus power like we do for Ssangsu, right? So there aren't that many kind of motions, right? There also aren't that many even blocking, like really hard blocking before moving on. It's a lot more soft. We usually use the false edge or the back of the sword to deflect, right? So if you think about, again, the knee blocks before vertical cuts. If you think about, again, in this particular form, right, here, using the back of the sword to catch their sword and also throw them, right? So this is fairly new. So I want to throw them, hit their back, and then use this diagonal to check behind me, right? So again, in the form, hook, right? So hook behind them, throw, again, use your momentum, cut, check, right? So again, this is fairly new, but again, using the false edge, the back of the sword, right, in a new way. Now, in the next segment, right, in the Can We Retcon, again, have we used false edge to block before? Yes. Have we used it to do it in this particular way? Not as overtly, although I would say there's also another instance, but this is new, right? So again, using the false edge, again, the back of the sword as your main defense, especially if you are using a shorter sword, makes sense. So the second warning of this one, right? So the third one I'm going to mention is kind of based on a pet peeve, right? So again, if you already stopped watching just because like, oh, it's not canonical, I'm not going to listen, we're not going to listen to this one, so I'm very free. But the idea is this block, right? So now in 12, we allegedly are kind of like doing something like weird like that. This one, we're allegedly, again, using the blade of our hand to reinforce it. Now, if you've ever actually tried to block with this, like a powered cut to your face, no, right? It's very painful. Even if you're using the meat of your hand, doesn't work, right? There is a different variation, right? So this block that we do a little bit more like, so in Shimsong, for example, with our sliding and our parries, right, is different, right? So that's clearly a deflection. this is kind of directed almost like it's a direct block. Now again, if you've done this with your hand, it'll hurt. So what else is going on, right? So this is also kind of piggybacking on my idea that the Yedo is? That sounds grammatically weird, but the Yedo is primarily engaging a one-handed sword. So we're going to do what I kind of learned as in the Eskrima block, right? So the idea here, so it's not here, right? So someone's giving you a center cut or a down cut or something like that. You're actually going to deflect, grab, right? So using the blade to actually absorb the brunt, in fact, all of the momentum of the cut. You're going to grab their wrist, and then you're going to engage with the rest of the form. Now in the form, right, we're here, we pop up, and then cut, which also feels a little bit strange because if again, if I didn't break my hand doing this, I pop it up in order to go for your knee, sword's still there, right? The sword's still going to try to aim for my head, not great for me. So all in all, like if you do this merely by what you're again shown, it doesn't make sense, it's going to hurt, it might look pretty, but it doesn't work. Versus a Eskrima block, right? That sword's coming in, I'm deflecting to the side a little bit more, right? So it's still upward motion as well. But the main thing is I'm grabbing your wrist, right? I'm grabbing your wrist, you can't cut me. What's the next move? Pop. Very easy, right? So again, sword's coming in, pop, pop, knee strike, and then you cut them down, right? So this is, again, a new type of block, right? Now I'm going to talk about retconning later, but this is fairly new, right? And again, this is an interpretation because the current interpretation for me doesn't really cut it as much as I would like it to, right? So again, take this whole video with a grain of salt just because these are all really my ideas because I haven't been happy with current interpretations and stuff like that. So I'll pass that guilt on to you, right? But let's talk about retconning these ideas. So the first one was merely using specifically thrust, but again, you can kind of turn it into really anything that's offensive, using an offensive position as a quote-unquote defense. And yeah, we can probably imagine, again, a few different ways we can still do that, right? Now, again, most of us, usually when we're fighting, are going to be like in our middle guard. If we're trying to feel fancy, we might do some of these other guys. But you can use, again, a thrust as a defense. Now, in the old ways, so again, in 7, you would thrust, and then you would block, right? Which, again, most likely you weren't actually puncturing them, right? Because then you're kind of trying to pull it back and push them off to the side again. Now it's just a defense, right? So it's just a defense this way. But we can use, again, stabs. You can use, again, more aggressive turns here as, again, defenses. In fact, we do see this in 10, right? So we're here this way. So this is usually a preparation for a thrust, but it's also just a nice defense, again, letting you know I'm coming for you, and then strike the camera, right? Obviously not striking a camera, you're striking, enemies. But yeah, so the idea, again, is we can't obviously retcon the idea. We can still use offensive, specifically thrusts, right? But we can use offensive moves as our defenses. Now time to get in trouble with the Federation. I talked about the Eskrima block. So again, what I mean by Eskrima block is that block and grab. There is a point that I do retcon this pretty consistently for my people going for black belt in Form 8. Because we do use this block, sort of, right? So we just stab some poor sod on the ground, someone's coming in for us, we allegedly block this way, right? But in fact, another way you could interpret this is, again, in the Eskrima block. You can deflect, grab, and then use that momentum. You can either throw them, dislodge them, just kind of get them out of the way, right? So you can use that, again, as a block and grab. So there are times you can, again, retcon this particular idea, and it's useful. Again, if you do a lot of sparring and you're getting more used to grappling the other person's arm and stuff like that, it's going to be useful. So stay safe, right? So stay safe, make sure you don't, anger higher ups and all that fun stuff, but stay safe, stay humble, and now start to, keep training. Haidong!